Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books, out loud. This right here is a little blue book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 1266, and it is entitled Great Fighters for Freedom, written by J.V. Nash. And it was copyright 1928, so this is Great Fighters for Freedom according to 1928 America. And this is part 4. And we left off at the bottom. No, at the top of page 34. Sorry, 34. I had to pause there because I wasn't sure where the hell I was. Alrighty, and so he had no use for the sweet reasonableness preached by Ursimus. Thus Europe was doomed for over 100 years to be the scene of bloody religious wars. The infallibility of the Bible was set up against that of the Church, and the rival zealots fought through seas of blood for undisputed mastery. When Ursimus died in 1536, the din of religious warfare was raging all about him. England, too, was aflame, and his old friend Sir Thomas More had fallen beneath the axe. On his deathbed, Ursimus murmured some pious phrases, but when the end approached, the cultured Latin, which he had used all his life, dropped from him, and with his last breath he gasped in the old, long-forgotten Low Dutch of his fathers, "Leave God," or "Good God." Perhaps he was thinking, what a world. And it is significant that in his will, contrary to the common practice of the day, he left no money for requiem masses and no legacies to the Church. Aside from a few personal bequests, he gave his property in trust for the aged and sick, for the education of worthy young men, and for providing poor girls with marriage portions. In the wars of religion, into which Europe was then plunging, thousands of lives were sacrificed and unspeakable misery brought upon innocent people in disputes over theological doctrines, which educated persons have now long since ceased to take seriously. The old Church, alarmed at this unexpected result of the humanistic enlightenment, was galvanized into new life and adopted a sternly reactionary attitude. The Jesuits sprang up under the fanatical Loyola to fight that humanism which was now erroneously identified with Protestant theology, the New Learning, and all its works were condemned. The writings of Ursimus were placed on the index as dangerous and forbidden reading. Good Catholics openly denounced him as an atheist, while Orthodox Protestants continued to regard him as a time-serving hypocrite. So the intellectual progress of Europe was set back for generations. During all that time, Ursimus was in eclipse. But at last, he is coming once again into the light. For it is now perceived that Ursimus, and not Luther, was on the right track, the keen English thinker. Mark Pattenson believed that the Greek Testament of Ursimus contributed more to the liberation of the human mind from the thraldom of the clergy than all the uproar and rage of Luther's many pamphlets. The liberal principles of Ursimus are those held by modern man everywhere, while the narrow dogmas of Luther have been generally discarded. Only fundamentalists today expect to be justified by faith and cling to the infallibility of the Bible. In fine, the ideals of Ursimus are now seen to be the hope of the world, and the goal to which men and women in all the lands are striving for the realization of the good life. Among individuals and among peoples, they are the ideas of culture and education, tolerance, international peace, just government, freedom of thought and opinion, expanded judgment, simple ethics in the place of theology, the abandonment of bigotry and superstition, and in all things the appeal to reason. Boy, they had no idea what we were going to turn into. Next chapter. Copernicus, the man who started it all. How Copernicus sent the earth whirling through space. Of all human discoveries, that the motion of the earth was by far the most revolutionary, and will stand for all time as the greatest achievement of the mind of man. Today it is an axiomatic that we give it little thought. Nobody ventures to question it except the members of a few illiterate religious sects. It has been the foundation of all scientific achievement during the last 3 or 4 centuries. Without it, we should still be living in a world of fanciful myth, childish ignorance, and groveling superstition. Looking back over the comparatively brief period which separates us from the 16th century, we realize with somewhat of a shock that the most advanced sections of mankind still took their astronomy from Claudius Ptolemy, P-T-O-L-E-M-Y, Ptolemy, an Egyptian of the 2nd century A.D. According to the Ptolemaic system, the earth was fixed and immovable at the center of the whole universe. Surrounding it was a great sphere called the Perineum Mobile, which rotated daily, carrying with it the various celestial bodies, the sun and moon traveling in eccentric circles around the earth, while the planets revolved in circles about a point which in turn traveled in an eccentric circle around the sun. The sun, moon, and planets were supposed to be very small bodies. The purpose of the sun was to illuminate the earth by day. And that of the moon to do so by night, while the planets, as they passed through the different signs of the zodiac, determined the fortunes of human beings and of nations. An able and enlightened a ruler, as Queen Elizabeth maintained an official astrologer, the famous Dr. D, whose duties were to forecast auspicious days for the beginning of important public undertakings. For 1400 years, this explanation of the universe, to us so incredibly preposterous, stood unshaken, seemingly as firm as the rock of Gibraltar. To be sure, it satisfactorily explained the apparent motions of the sun, moon, and planets, and even of the stars, as seen by the naked eye. And it fitted into perfection with the prevailing theology, for it made the earth the most important part of the visible creation, to which all the heavenly bodies paid homage, and man, the lord of the earth, conceived of the universe as existing for his special benefit. Above the firmament, theology placed heaven, and down below the earth lay a physical hell. So plausible was the Ptolemaic system, and so congenial to man's self-complacency, that even the Reformation did nothing to shake it. Luther and all the other reformers accepted it without question. So, indeed, did Francis Bacon, the greatest philosopher of his day, who lived nearly 100 years after the modern or Copernican system was published to the world. To question the Ptolemaic system seemed like denying the evidence of one's senses, and nothing short of the shakest madness. Never did a scientist take a bolder step or run a greater risk than did he who first laid profane hands upon Ptolemy's astronomy. This man was Nicholas Copernicus. Among all the benefactors of humanity, there is none who is more deserving of honor than Copernicus. Yet few have received such scant recognition. Nearly 400 years after his death, his figure is still a vague and shadowy one, almost hidden in the mists of history. There has been only one adequate biography of Copernicus written, and that was in German, over 40 years ago. There is no English translation of it, page Joseph McCage. Nor does there appear to be any English life, in book form, of the father of modern astronomy. The achievement of Copernicus impresses one as almost incredible when it is recalled that he worked out his epoch-making discovery of the notion of the earth 100 years before the invention of telescopes, his only aids being some simple wooden instruments of his own construction. It is true that some of the ancient Greeks had speculated upon the sphericity and motion of the earth, and even achieved an estimate of its size. But they never succeeded in firmly establishing these theories or carrying them to their logical conclusions. The theories themselves were soon laughed away and remained practically forgotten for many centuries. However, these early speculations of the Greek became known after the revival of learning in Europe and furnished a stimulating suggestion to Copernicus, which he was to follow up with such startling results. Our information about Copernicus is all too scanty. We know that he was born in the little town of Thorn in Poland, February 19th, 1473, his father being Polish and his mother German. This Polish-German combination is the same that produced in the 19th century another of the world's outstanding men of genius, Friedrich Nietzsche. Copernicus is the Latinized form of a Slavic name, Kopernik. The boy was Christian Nicholas. His father was a native of Krakow, but had established himself in business at Thorn as a wholesale trader. The mother belonged to a family of respectable mercantile and civic connections. The father died when Nicholas was 10 years old, whereupon the boy was adopted by a maternal uncle, one Lucas Waltzrode, who in 1489 became bishop of Ermeland. Nicholas was first sent to school at Thorn in 1491. Being now 18 years old, he was allowed to go to the University of Krakow, where for 3 years he applied himself to the study of mathematics. He seems also to have developed some little talent for painting. The fellow was versatile, as we shall see later. He must have had a natural thirst for knowledge and fortunately for the world he had He must have had a natural thirst for knowledge, and fortunately for the world he had the economic means of satisfying it. Since at the age of 23 he set out for Italy, where he registered at the famed University of Bologna. Here we find him studying canon law, possibly a sop to his episcopal uncle. But we may be sure that he found more excitement in his attendance on the astronomical lectures given by Domenico Novara. His stay at Bologna lasted 2 years. In 1497 he received an appointment as canon for the Cathedral of Freiburg, near his old home. Possibly this was a sinecure. Possibly this was a sinecure obtained through the influence of his uncle, the bishop, as a contribution to the young collegian's support. At any rate, he was enabled to return to Italy after a brief visit home. Mathematics and astronomy had now gained so strong a hold on him that by 1500 he was delivering lectures of his own on those subjects in Rome. Then he went off to Praga, the seat of another great medieval university, for the study of medicine. Here he remained until 1505. In the meantime he qualified for the doctorate in canon law at Ferrara, receiving his degree on May 31st of 1503. Copernicus was now 30 years old. His Wanderjahr over, he returned permanently to the homeland. He settled in Heidelberg as physician to his uncle, the bishop. Here he remained until the latter's death in 1512. This must have been a serious blow for Copernicus, but he was not thrown out upon the world. Evidently, he had kept the canonship at Freiburg to receive in reserve for just such an emergency, for after the demise of the bishop, he repaired to that city and took up the duties of the position. Copernicus is commonly spoken of as a monk or a priest. The fact is, however, that he never took holy orders, a peculiar and perhaps significant. Oops, turn the page. Just one page, please. Still got a couple pages there. Come on, separate everybody. There we go. A peculiar and perhaps significant circumstance, in view of his doctorate in canon law and his close relationship to an influential bishop. We might have made his path of advancement in the church an easy one. Besides his canonship, he also secured the post of commissary of the Diocese of Ermland. Evidently, the duties of both positions were one which a layman could perform. The interests of Copernicus were extraordinarily varied. As a physician, he was highly successful, was generous with professional services to the poor, and had many wealthy patrons. Finance and economics interested him, too. He wrote a report on currency reform, which was submitted to the Diet. I wonder what the Diet is. That he was an accomplished classical scholar is evidenced by his Latin translation of the Greek epistles of Theophylact. 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 Don't know. But all the time, Copernicus was patiently continuing his astronomical researches through higher mathematics and a few little wooden instruments. His suspicion of the Ptolemaic system had its inception as early as his student days in Italy. After his return across the Alps, he began systematic work on his great problem. In 1513, at Frauenburg, he perfected the instruments which permitted him to put the Ptolemaic system to an actual test, something which had not been done before. The antiquated system, when subjected to even such crude tests as were possible without modern scientific apparatuses or telescopes, crumbled in his hands. Bringing to bear a keen intellect and an uncommon knowledge of mathematics, pardon me, Copernicus then began to work out a theory of astronomy based on the motion of the earth and the fixity of the sun. He himself must have been overwhelmed by the tremendous vista opening before his eyes when he proved to his own satisfaction that the earth, far from being the center of the universe, based on everlasting foundations, was merely a minor planet swimming through the immensities of space. The sensation produced by this unparalleled discovery no doubt eclipsed in intensity the ascribed by Keats to some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, and to stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. Thus it was that Copernicus was the lever of his marvelous mind, dislodged the earth from its immemorial foundations, and pushed it out whirling through space, along with the other planets. Round the sun he fixed the time and consumed by the six then known planets, and completing their orbits as follows: Mercury 87 days, Venus 224 days, the Earth 365 days, Mars 1 year and 321 days, Jupiter 11 years, and Saturn 29 years. All this sounds so elementary to us today that it excites little interest. But in Copernicus's day, the very thought of human beings clinging to a revolving globe, dashing through the depths of space in a wild race round the sun, was terrifying in its novelty. One notion of the earth would have been bad enough, but Copernicus endowed it with two: a revolution on its own axis at the rate of approximately 1,000 miles an hour at the surface, and a rotation round the sun at a rate of 1,110 miles per minute. We now know that it has still a third motion, plunging through space with the whole solar system. Copernicus naturally was cautious about announcing such devastating discoveries. However, in 1530 he completed the writing of a treatise on the subject. In his introduction to the famous treatise he said, "When now I had for a long time reflected upon the uncertainty that pervaded all of mathematical results then existing as to the motions of the planets, it began to be repellent to me that the philosophers, who would investigate with such extraordinary care the most insignificant details of the course of the heavenly bodies, should yet find no ground for the movement of the world machine. He also prepared a brief abstract, giving a popular account of the theory, which he circulated among his friends. Some lectures were given on the subject, even at Rome. The seeming impossibility of such a theory's truth must have prevented any serious attention being paid to it. No doubt it seemed as fantastic as did a Jules Verne romance to the public of the 19th century. The Pope himself was complacent, and a Cardinal, Schoenberg, even suggested the publication of the manuscript, but Copernicus was well aware of the dynamite which the new theory contained. A manuscript could circulate without much danger. Copernicus, however, was now getting to be an old man, and he feared the consequences of publication. Finally, in 1540, his friends, after much urging, secured his assent to the publishing of the work. His disciple, George Jacob Rheticus, printed at Danzig in that year a short preliminary exposition on the Copernican system under the title Narrative Prima, or First Narrative. At the same time, he began to put through the press at Nuremberg the complete manuscript of Copernicus, bearing the title De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, of the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. The printing of the book seems to have been a slow job. At any rate, when the first printed copy reached Frauenburg, Copernicus was on his deathbed, for he had been stricken with apoplexy and paralysis late in 1542, and he expired on May 24th of 1543, aged 70 years. So the book was tenderly placed in the master's almost lifeless hands, as he lay unconscious awaiting the end. Copernicus had taken the precaution of dedicating the book to the reigning Pope Paul III, an expedient which was also adopted by Ursimus and later by Voltaire, as a protective measure. Even so, the timid publishers, without the knowledge of Copernicus, slipped into the book an anonymous preface, protesting that the new system of astronomy was put forward merely as a tentative hypothesis. But the master was already beyond the reach of foes. It was only after the death of Copernicus that the storm of opposition came to a head. As late as 1633, Galileo was condemned by the ecclesiastical authorities for teaching the motion of the earth, which was officially repudiated by the Church. Until 1835, volumes upholding the new astronomy were placed on the index of forbidden books. The Ptolemaic system died hard. Even in the early days of American universities, it was not entirely discredited, and continued to be taught along with the not yet universally accepted Copernican system. The memory of Copernicus is still kept green at Krakow by a statue of heroic proportions executed by the great Danish sculptor Thorwaldsen. At the foot of that statue, a grateful humanity should lay a wreath every year. And there we'll end this chapter, and we'll see you in part 5.